Okay. So I show it as 9 o'clock. I know we have quite a few things to get through, so I'm going to start this. So good morning. My name is Patricia Wyrick. I am the Rural Forestry Program Coordinator for South Dakota Department of Agriculture and Natural Resources. We are very appreciative that Calvin Norman with Pennsylvania State Extension and Daphne Goddess, with Michigan State University to present tree management and carbon. Before we get started, I do have a few housekeeping items that need to be discussed. Today's workshop will be recorded, with recordings being placed on the DANR's YouTube channel for public viewing once reviewed and approved by the DANR's technical support team. DANR is an equal opportunity provider and wants to encourage participation. However, if you would not like to be a part of the live recording, an email when the recordings are uploaded will be sent to everyone who is registered for this webinar. All microphones and videos have been turned off, and due to bandwidth concerns, we request that they stay off during the presentation. At the end of the presentation, we will be taking questions. All questions can be placed in the chat box, or you can raise your hand and be allowed to turn on your microphone. Anyone seeking Society of American Forester continuing education credits, please put your information in the chat box during this presentation. And with that, we are honored to have Calvin, who is an extension educator in forestry and wildlife through Penn State Extension, and is a Wisconsin native who earned a master's degree from Clemson University, and Daphne, who is a program coordinator for the Forest, Carbon, and Climate program at Michigan State University. Michigan State University's Forest, Carbon, and Climate program aims to increase understanding and implementation of climate-smart forest management with links climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. With that, I'm going to stop presentation, and who would like control? Calvin, you are muted. Hold on one sec, Calvin. You're still muted.
There we go. I got it. Sorry. You always got to have a technical issue or two. Then you can get started. All right. Are you guys seeing the presentation? Wonderful. Wonderful. Okay, let's make sure that it works. And there we go. Okay, so thank you for the invitation. We're super happy to be here. So today we're going to be talking about tree management with carbon and carbon. So just to kick things off, I just want to run through the carbon cycle just so we all remember, because I know it's been a couple of weeks since we talked about this. So just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So forests sequester carbon through photosynthesis. They pull carbon dioxide out of the air, they turn into sugar, and it's stored in the tree in the form of wood, also in their needles. When trees die, they release that carbon back into the atmosphere, and that's kind of the natural carbon cycle. Also, some of that carbon gets stored underground in forest soils, which are really great at holding carbon. Now, we can kind of extend that storage out if we turn trees into, a long-lived wood product like a table. For example, the table in my living room is like a 130-year-old table that I think my great-grandfather or his dad made. I don't know. It's really old and it's white oak and it's super cool. So, if we have products like that, in houses, and we bank houses out of wood that are around for a long time, then we can really extend the storage of carbon and keeping that carbon out of the atmosphere. So, but now we've done the basic carbon cycle. Let's really jump into the meat of the presentation. So before we, kind of just talk all about management stuff, let's think about why we own land. So, maybe you own your forest land for some cultural values or something that you really like to do out there, or, and some indigenous life pathways. Maybe you like to camp on your forest. That's great. I love it. Or maybe you have some recreational stuff that you like to do. After this presentation, I'm going to go out and hunt some deer. So not quite as big as elk. We have elk in Pennsylvania, but they're just hard to get a tag for. So we all own forests for different reasons. I don't think anyone really owns forests for carbon sequestration, but our forests can be really great at sequestering and storing carbon. And so we're going to talk about that today. So let's look at the nation as a whole. Where do forests play in? How are we doing? So if we look at the US forests, they sequester about 16% of US emissions. That's 866 million tons or million metric tons of carbon a year in trees. Unfortunately, most of that sequestration is being done east of the Mississippi. Unfortunately, Rocky Mountains, where you guys are, is a carbon, well, depending on which paper you read, it's either almost a source or is a source of carbon. So that means the forests are emitting more carbon dioxide than they're pulling in. And the Pacific coast, again, depending on which paper you read and how recent it is, the Pacific coast is either almost a source or becoming a source of carbon dioxide, which is not great. So the reason why these forests are becoming sources of carbon dioxide are twofold. One, they're increasing pests in the forest. I'm sure you guys are all aware of the mountain pine beetle outbreak that hit the Black Hills. Over the course of 10 years, 21 million trees were killed by mountain pine beetle. That's a lot of trees. And then you extend that over the whole, Rocky Mountain area, a lot of trees were lost, and that releases carbon, as well as the large stand replacing fires that I'm sure you all have seen and are a lot more impacted than I am. But here's a nice little graph about how a stand replacing fire impacts a lodgepole pine stand in Montana. So you can see it's doing this, the pine stand is doing a really great job of, sequestering carbon. And then that fire blows through, and all of a sudden you go from sequestering carbon to having none. And it probably released a lot of carbon. Now, over 150 years, that forest can go back to sequestering carbon, but we don't have 150 years to really get that back. So we need to make sure, we need to figure out what's going on and stop the bleeding. So our forests are threatened by a number of things. We're seeing hotter and drier summers, and we also have really high fuel loading, which leads to these really intense wildfires. There's also a number of other things that we could get into, but this presentation is not about wildfire. So we're not going to dig into the details of wildfires. We're also seeing hotter, drier summers, which are causing, the trees are being more stressed, and it's also really great for some of our forest pests. Drought is stressing the trees that are already stressed by hot, dry summers, making them more susceptible to being killed by pests that, wouldn't have killed them in the past. And then we're also losing some of our habitat suitability, especially on trees that are kind of like, they were just getting by to begin with, but now as, things heat up, they're retreating more northward. Daphne is going to talk a lot about habitat suitability, so I'm not going to dig too much into that. When we look at our forest pests, we're seeing increased impacts from pests and pathogens. This is partially due to, just a longer growing season. So pests can be more active, they can get more generations in, which is obviously more lethal to trees. And then also we're seeing an increase in root fungi. This year in Pennsylvania right now, it's our 5th wettest year on record. We still have a month to go, and we've had rain forever. So we have a really great, climate right now for fungi. So we're seeing a lot of fungi killing stuff here in Pennsylvania. So I'm sure you guys are seeing similar things out west, which is just not great. Also, we're seeing more invasive species come in as, our trees get stressed. You increase invadability by invasives, and habitats become more suitable for non-native plants and insects, which is really tough on our forests. We're also seeing a loss of species diversity. As these trees get stressed and disappear, we lose them, and then we have issues with our structure and our species. Niches that were open that were filled are now open, and it's a whole issue when you lose species in an ecosystem. As well as we're seeing kind of our forests shift into just like middle-aged forests. We don't really have any early successional forests or late successional forests. So we really lose those open meadows and those old growth stands, which is really tough on a lot of our wildlife species, as well as our forests. So how do we manage forests to increase carbon in them? Well, the first thing we want to do is we want to, to increase our carbon mitigation. I was getting ahead of myself. So we increase carbon inputs into the forest. So we make sure those forests are sucking down more carbon. We reduce the loss, so we need that more. And then we're also going to generate wood products. That one's really simple. We're building stuff out of wood, and we're using wood wherever we can. Now, managing to increase carbon is a little bit tricky, so we want to increase stocking levels in the forest. However, we want to make sure they're below. We don't want to just like put trees everywhere, because we've seen what happens when we do that. we get large wildfires. So we want to make sure we have a good stocking levels in stands, but keep them below wildfire and pest risks. And we also want to make sure we're protecting our forest soils and we're getting wood into those soils. So when operations happen in forests, we want to make sure that we're not causing any erosion and we're treating our soil very nicely because it is a great carbon sink. We also want to make sure we're increasing productivity in our forests. So we want to protect existing trees when we're doing management, and we want to manage to encourage regeneration in there. And we want to reduce our threats and improve forest health. That's done a lot by increasing species diversity where possible. You guys don't have the most diverse forest just because of the climate in South Dakota, but we want to make sure we're managing for all species. Now, avoiding the losses, it seems pretty easy, but this is the big thing for the West Coast. If we can get if we can get the West to stop emitting so much carbon, we'll be in a better place. So we want to do remediation for right now and also the long term. You can see this graphic on the right here. It shows our current distribution of Doug fir, and there's not a lot of Doug fir in South Dakota, but it's a good species for what we're about to show. So right now it's all over here, but as the climate warms and as we see habitats change, it has to retreat further north to really survive. So that's what we mean by long-term losses. So we can do this prevention by doing some fuels treatment, and we also want to make sure we're addressing vulnerabilities in the forest, and we want to make sure we're really thinning to reduce both drought stress and also fires and insects, both native and non-native. So we really want to make sure we're reducing the number of overstock stands that we have out there. Now this kind of seems like counterintuitive. I'm saying that we need to thin forests to make sure that we're sequestering as much carbon as possible. Like, how does this balance out? Well, you can see where it balances out here in this graphic. So we just have a forest that is unmanaged, it's sequestering carbon, and then a large loss comes through, versus one that is managed with resiliency in mind. It's been thinned out, it doesn't have this large loss, and so it sequesters more carbon over time. Also, they have increased wildlife values and are more adaptable to other risks. So some treatments that we can do to increase carbon stored in our forest, again, this kind of sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but it's really to staunch the wildfire and the bleeding, is to do fuels reduction work. There's a huge need for it, not only in South Dakota, but the West Coast in general. There's 28 million acres of forest that need some fuels reduction, and this is not even thinning, just like going in there and removing the small trees, getting out some of that really intense fuel layer, so that way you can do prescribed fire, and you can actually do management without that threat of a blow up and fires escaping. It's a small loss in short-term carbon, but it is a long-term benefit because we're not seeing huge blowups. It's kind of expensive, but we got to do it to really prevent losses. And then the next thing we want to make sure we're doing is we're doing commercial thinnings, where possible and sustainable. A good commercial thinning, it improves the growth of remaining trees. So we're enhancing our long-term sequestration. We're also we're maintaining a good diverse forest. So it's not just one species in there, and we're having good structure to reduce the likelihood of wildfire. Also, these things are just great for our wildlife. Wildlife love forests that have some disturbance in them, and they want that. We need a diversity on of habitat in the landscape for most of our wildlife species, and we increase our resistance to drought and insects, especially our non-native insects. And personally, I just prefer walking through a forest that is not a jungle. It's much easier to walk through and to enjoy a forest that is not overstocked. So we want to make sure we're providing good habitat and we're really reducing potential losses to wildfire. Now, the last thing we want to do is invasive species management. It seems like it really isn't going to impact carbon, but the emerald ash borer has killed roughly 1 billion ash in the US. That's a huge carbon release. So, and that's just one insect. So we want to make sure we're not introducing new species. Now, I know a lot of the folks on this call are homeowners and landowners, so you don't really think that you have any input on invasive species, but you actually do. You have a lot of power here. A lot of our invasive species have come over in ornamental plants or as ornamentals. So we want to make sure we're using plants that are native and they're from local nurseries to reduce, bringing in plants from Europe, from South America, from Asia, from even the Eastern United States, where we have different pests than you guys do. So we want to use local plants and we want to use them from local nurseries. Also, it's important to know your native plant species. So you can do what's called EDRR, or early detection and rapid response. I love it. It's great. So it's much easier to remove invasive species the second they show up than rather when it's a really intense stand of invasives. And you want to remove invasives whenever and wherever you can. I did a little bit of digging and it looks like your biggest invasive species out there are knotweed, which we have a ton of in Pennsylvania, and I hate that dang plant. Salt cedar and purple loosestrife, so you want to make sure you're hitting those whenever you can. And then, just like we talked about before, we want to make sure we're managing forests to ensure diversity, so we don't have just windrows that are all ash that can just be killed by one pest. This is unfortunately a lesson we've had to learn multiple times over, with Dutch elm disease, hemlock woolly adelgid on the East Coast, emerald ash borer, chestnut blight. We want to make sure we have diversity in our forests. This is both your forest, like big forest land, and then also your yard and urban forests. So we want to make sure we're managing for diversity wherever possible. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Daphne here.
Thank you, Calvin. So today I'm going to go through some of what Calvin mentioned with the management for climate change mitigation and adaptation. But we're going to take a little bit of a narrower view and focus on some of the primary communities that exist within South Dakota. But before we get started on all of that, I wanted to cover some of these kind of foundational concepts when it comes to assessing risk in your forest stands and forest communities that you own. So two major concepts that are often evaluated are climate change vulnerability and also changes to suitable habitat that are projected through models. So climate change vulnerability can be the degree to which a system or a species is susceptible to and unable to cope with adverse effects of climate change. So oftentimes this is related to some sort of threshold, which can be, it can be pests and disease, it can be fire, it can be a temperature threshold, something that makes either a species or a certain forest type less able to survive and succeed under these different disturbances and conditions. Suitable habitat is an area in which a species can or does occur. And this is an important concept to understand fully because it's thrown around a lot, but what's important here is that it doesn't necessarily mean that the species will occupy all of that space in the future, but that it can. So if you look on the graphic on the right, this is an oak hickory example, which is shown in these bright orange sections kind of in the middle of the country. So models project that suitable habitat will expand over time for oak hickory stands. Increasing temperatures and conditions becoming more dry in general favors this forest type. And so you can see it's expanding very widely over the country. But just because you can see it's moved into northern Michigan over here doesn't mean that in 2100 that the Upper Peninsula will be completely dominated by oak hickory. It just means that area will likely be able to support oak hickory communities. And so whether or not a stand will or will not be found there, or a stand type will or will not be found there, will depend on a lot of factors. Its ability to migrate by itself, if people have planted it out there. So there's a couple of factors that come into play when it comes to shifts in suitable habitat and actual realization of shifting into that suitable habitat. And so under climate change, these shifts in suitable habitat oftentimes do occur more rapidly than these communities are able to migrate. So looking at the oak hickory example, it's been rated as relatively low vulnerability to climate change, and that's because, like I said, it can deal with these warmer conditions, and it's also better adapted to disturbances than some of the other forest communities on the eastern half of the country. And its suitable habitat is expected to increase, but its actual expansion might be limited from there. All right, next. When looking at projections, especially for suitable habitat and adaptability, you want to consider scale. You always want to have that in mind. So a habitat projection for, let's say, species X, this is just an example species. Let's say that currently it resides in northern Illinois and southern Michigan, and then, by 2100, it's going to shift, suitable habitat is going to shift a lot more into Michigan. It's going to shift northward. So if you look at a habitat projection for Illinois, you're going to see that that species is projected to decline. If you're looking at one for Michigan, you're going to see projections that it's expected to increase. And if you look at projections for that species across the entire United States, you might find that it's not expected to change at all, meaning that overall suitable habitat area is going to remain about the same, even if it's shifting northward. Next. So this is a table I pulled from the Climate Change Tree Atlas, which I'll detail further a little bit later here. But the main point here is that it shows us some useful information about these model projections for certain species. So it does not contain all of the major species in South Dakota because these models used 125 of the most common species in the eastern US. So you can see ponderosa pine is missing. But what's important here is to look at this adaptability column. So how is it projected to respond to climate change? Is it supposed to do well under climate change, or is it supposed to not do well? So for example, this one has a low adaptability. And then the other things to look at is these change numbers are changes to suitable habitat. So green ash is projected to have small declines. This is a low emissions climate change scenario and a high emission. So we're kind of expecting that the globe is going to go in a high emissions direction with our current emissions. So this might have a small decline in suitable habitat. What's interesting here is that if you have stands that are just declining, and have multiple high risk factors for climate change, meaning they aren't likely to improve under climate change, you might want to look at some of these new habitat species at the bottom. So these are species that don't currently reside in South Dakota, but in the future may have actual suitable habitat in your state and could potentially be planted there to transition a forest community from one type to another. Next. So this is a figure I pulled from a summary on South Dakota forest communities from 2005. And this is just to show the diversity within the state. It's obviously very dominated by ponderosa pine. And we're going to look at the ponderosa pine community, but we're also going to look at elm ash cottonwood as one community in this presentation, and some of the assessments that have looked at that community and future risks, vulnerabilities, and outlooks. Next. So we'll start with ponderosa pine. Next. So ponderosa pine communities have variable vulnerability to climate change, meaning it kind of depends on the site itself and the risk factors that exist on that site. So it has both beneficial attributes that could help it be resilient to climate change stressors, and it also has some susceptibility to climate change stressors. So it will depend, where those stressors exist will impact how vulnerable those stands will be to climate change. Some beneficial attributes about ponderosa pine stands is that they are adapted to dry sites, which are expected to increase on the landscape. And they tolerate low severity fires. So the fact that they're disturbance adapted at all already gives them an edge over forest types that are not disturbance adapted. Just considering the fact that under climate change, disturbances of all kinds are expected to increase in extent, frequency, and severity. So some of the key climate-related threats for ponderosa pine specifically are projections for reduced regeneration potential under climate change. So this can deal with, droughts, like extended severe drought seasons, which can really impact regeneration. And then also, severe disturbances, especially stand replacing disturbances, can diminish seed sources for future natural regeneration. And then although ponderosa pine, is adapted to low severity fire, it can be completely wiped out by these high severity fires, especially under high fuel loads, as Kelvin mentioned. And these high severity fires can leave a stand barren and without seed sources. So it's really important to try to avoid these stand replacing fires and remove ladder fuels that could make a low severity fire turn into a crown fire. The other major risk here, obviously, is mountain pine beetle, which has been a major problem in ponderosa pine for many, many years now. And this figure on the right shows mountain pine beetle damage from 2006 to 2010. I expect it's become more severe since then. But something I'd like to point out here is these high severity fires, mountain pine beetle, and things such as drought can all be lumped together and kind of thought of as density dependent stressors. So, your risk for a high severity fire increases as your density increases. Your risk for having a mountain pine beetle outbreak in an otherwise healthy stand is going to increase as your density is increased. So something that you could focus on to kind of address multiple challenges is thinking about, how do I reduce density to improve resilience to these stressors? Next. So like I said, some of the major goals here are to reduce the density, to increase resilience, and kind of maintain the healthy trees that you do have and want to perpetuate. Trying to bring it back to historical structure and composition. So, those low severity fire regimes is something that we might want to restore in these systems if you want to perpetuate them and continue producing timber on them, and improve in general the productivity and regeneration potential of your stand. So some direct actions that can be taken, as Calvin mentioned, is that understory treatments, so understory clearing, traditional thinnings or partial cuts, and prescribed fire are great tools that you can use, and you can reach out to your local experts to help you, develop a treatment plan or a management plan to carry out some of these practices. And also by addressing these density dependent stressors, you're also maintaining trees that provide that valuable seed source, and having diverse mature trees with diverse seeds improves resilience genetically as well. Next. I'm going to talk a little bit about that elm ash cottonwood group I mentioned. Next. So these are really important systems. They're typically owned by private owners, and they're very unique from other forest types. So they occupy these really niche, very wet, saturated sites. They have extremely high levels of biodiversity, which is critical for, in a sense of resilience to climate change stressors. Just maintaining biodiversity is always kind of a win-win scenario. And general management of these stands kind of involves just cleaning them up, getting rid of the undesired or low quality species, and they tend to regenerate well on their own. Next. So they have these really niche vulnerabilities to climate change because they're very diverse. So they have, inherently higher resilience, and they live in these niche environments, meaning that they have reduced competition from other species trying to invade, like other forest types per se. So they're not as high of a risk for losing their current habitat, and they're tolerant of variable precipitation. However, changes to like hydrology, the timing and the intensity of flooding that occurs can really impact the seed establishment sites. So that can impact regeneration in a negative way. These increasing severe storms, hurricanes, really severe downpours can also negatively impact regeneration, obviously. So just trying to maintain the natural variability in hydrology is a key goal for maintaining these systems. And then, of course, you have elm and ash in these systems, which are both highly vulnerable to pests and pathogens, elm with Dutch elm disease and ash with emerald ash borer. So always keeping that in mind as well. Although these stands tend to be more resilient in a general sense, you always need to keep an eye out for these pests and diseases that can quickly change the quality and vigor of your stand. Next. So taking a little bit of a closer look at green ash by itself, this species is really well adapted to climatic extremes. So it might be kind of great to have on your landscape and perpetuate. It can regenerate through stump sprouts, which is great. It gives it resilience to some mechanical damage and severe floods and the occasional wildfire. And although they tend to grow in these very moist sites, they can also survive periods of very low soil moisture. So they're more adapted to these extremes that are going to become more common under climate change. And there's a high potential to restore these trees. Of course, keeping in mind emerald ash borer and whether that's on your site and how severe the damage currently is. So some adaptive management tactics that can be focused on for green ash are just to reduce grazing, and that'll improve its regeneration potential. Promoting it in areas where it's either been reduced or has low population. So suppressing fire in those areas where you're trying to maintain your green ash, or planting post-disturbance. So either after emerald ash borer has come through, but especially after a wildfire, you might need that natural regen might need some added assistance. And then looking at climate change projections for South Dakota specifically, I drew these ideas from that table that I pulled from the climate change tree atlas. So it's rated as having moderate adaptability to projected climate change. So it can deal pretty well with climate change in South Dakota, although it's probably going to have a slight reduction in its suitable habitat through 2100. And that projected loss is largely driven by expected increases in emerald ash borer. Next. So to just highlight some of these resources where I draw a lot of my data for these courses and for this information, a great resource is the Climate Change Tree Atlas. Like I said, it has some limitations, right? So it focuses on the eastern US, and it doesn't have a comprehensive list of all the tree species and communities in South Dakota, but it can really give you really good information about how a tree is projected to do under climate change. And a lot of that information is transferable, right? So if it's telling you that green ash is projected to do well in general, but maybe has reduced habitat suitability in general in the eastern US, those ideas can be applied to South Dakota as well. And so they also assign adaptability ratings, like I overviewed a little bit. So they're qualitative in low, medium, and high. Makes it easy to kind of just get a quick glance. And then they also provide projection summaries at different geographies. So like I said, looking at the entire eastern US versus just your state. Next. And so just to get a little bit deeper into how these adaptability ratings are developed. So it's not just this vague, someone said, you know, I don't think it's gonna survive under climate change. We actually look at, or the Forest Service looks at 9 biological factors and 12 disturbance factors. So they look at what's the ecology of the species, what are things that would help it under climate change, and what are things that would harm it under climate change, and how does it respond to these kind of 12 disturbance impacts. And then the combination of these ratings kind of produces this overall adaptability rating. So here I have an example for red maple. Its overall adaptability is very high. You can see that's represented through all these really dark green boxes. And its main susceptibility is fire top kill, right? So it just, compared to other species, red maple just doesn't respond, regenerate after fire as well as other species might. Next. Another really great resource is the Climate Change Response Framework, which is hosted by the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Sciences, who helped us put together these presentations for our courses as well. So they have a host of really fantastic resources, again, not specific for South Dakota, but they do have some geographies that are very close. They have these vulnerability assessments for, you know, mostly in the northeastern US right now, but they kind of just discuss the actual geography and what the main impacts are there and how they're going to affect forests. They also do these projections for tree species, but in a little bit less of a technical sense than the tree atlas shows. They actually provide some more of that context of why is this projected to increase or decrease over time. And they have these fantastic field guides, which I really love. They don't have many. They're mostly just for the Northwoods. So they have them for northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. But I still think they're a fabulous resource in the sense that this I pulled actually directly out of the field guide for Minnesota. So, and this will let you look at site level characteristics of your stand to assess what level of risk you might have. So even if you have, a ponderosa pine stand or a fire dependent forest in general, you or your neighbor could have very different risk levels depending on how your site fares in these different topics. So if your stand has very low diversity, it's going to be less resilient to stressors in the future than if your stand has really high diversity, and so on and so forth. So even though these are made and developed for, Minnesota, something like this, it's just talking about a fire dependent forest, can be really, really valuable when thinking about, okay, am I trying to protect and maintain the forest community and forest type that I currently have? Or is it already, degraded, decreasing in quality, and unlikely to do any better under climate change? And should I consider something more drastic, such as a transition or something like that? Or maybe even just more drastic management. Next. And so I mentioned a couple times that we have a short course. So the Forest Carbon and Climate Program hosts these professional development courses. And a lot of these slides were drawn from content we've developed for regional courses on forest carbon and climate change. So we developed one for the Pacific Northwest, the Northeast, and the Southeast. And they consist of 4 presentations each. So one is just a general introduction to the geography, the current status of forests, and historical trends in usage and markets. We have projected climate change trends, as well as current climate change impacts, what's happened in the past, what's expected to happen in the future. And then we talk about more of the stuff I covered here, some of those individual forest communities, what are their risks, what are ways we can reduce those risks for those forest types. And then the adaptive management really goes into detail about some of those actions that Calvin highlighted in a general sense. So if your main goal is to reduce carbon losses, what can you do in this geography to meet that? Which forest types is it appropriate for? Which is it less appropriate for? So on and so forth, and a couple of case studies as examples. And we've also produced these original graphics using FIA data and a fantastic R package developed by an MSU alumni that allows us to kind of crunch these numbers and just produce these figures as needed. Next. I guess my last comment for the course is that it's not yet released, and it will be released at some point in 2022. But yeah, Calvin, if you want to take it away on your slide.
Sorry, my computer didn't want to let me do things besides click forward and backwards. Just gotta plug, gotta plug our own stuff. Michigan State is doing a lot of great stuff. Also at Penn State, we have a lot of information. We have 3 more articles out that are on this slide, and then we also have a number of free webinars about forests, forest carbon, all that kind of stuff. Feel free to just check it out at Penn State extension.psu.edu. Just put in anything you want. You can probably find something on there that will help you. And I think that's the end of the presentation for us today. Now, one thing that I forgot to mention at the beginning, but I should have mentioned, is we didn't get too much into the specifics of management because everyone's forest is a little bit different. And so we couldn't really get too prescriptive. And it's really important that you work with a forester and forestry professionals when you're managing your